ask me a question, or
Yeah. Okay, cool.
yeah.
So I'm gonna do this in phases. So sort of talk about the evacuation first. So do you remember where you were when war was declared?
Uh, yeah, when war was declared, I was 10 years old, and like any 10-year-old, I was only partially aware of the implications. There had been a great deal of preparation going on, men being called up, air raid shelters being built, and the news media was preparing the whole population for what seemed to be inevitable.
So do you remember how your family felt? I mean, did you help them prepare, or did they talk to you much about it?
Well, I was only 10, and I suppose my parents were focused on the war, not on their kids. So my sister and I were sort of sidelined. I think the war began with my parents just being worried about what the implications were and what was going to happen to us and all the rest of it. They weren't focused on us so much, perhaps, as the war itself. I don't know.
Sure, yeah. Do you think that sort of impacted a lot on your relationship with them at the time?
I think it did. I'm sure it did. And I'm sure it affected most families. Adults in the population were focused on what was going to happen to the family. Were we going to be bombed? Should they build air raid shelters? What was going to happen to work and being called up and so on? It's like stamping on an ant's nest. Everyone scurries around, and the kids they were considered, obviously, for evacuation. You had to protect the upcoming generation, but at the same time, they were really focused on the war, I think, and particularly after Dunkirk, because that was a great defeat for the
Sure,
British
yeah.
army.
So you mentioned people scurrying around and talking about building air shelters. Do you remember sort of what immediate precautions were taken?
Yes, my father, he'd been in the army in the First World War, and I think he was well aware of the implications involved in modern warfare. So he went into the garden and he built, with help, he got some laborers in, he built the most massive air raid shelter you could possibly think about. It was reinforced concrete, and old bedsteads were thrown into it and all the rest of it to reinforce it. And the walls were about 3 feet thick of concrete. It would have taken a direct hit, I think, too.
Wow. And sort of on a more broader spectrum, do you remember sort of at all, sort of in the long run, what precautions were taken generally? What messages did your government give you and that sort of thing?
Well, I'm not sure that I was particularly aware of the messages that came out of government, but generally the whole country was whipped into war fever, and we were encouraged to grow more food. We were encouraged to build air raid shelters and to take shelter in the underground stations in London, and so there was very much an awareness of preparations for war. Yeah, even before the war started on September the 3rd, I was aware that these preparations were going on.
Sure. And I mean, I know you were only 10, but were you able to help much with sort of the growing of the vegetables and that sort of thing?
Only peripherally, I think. We weren't really terribly involved.
Sure.
As a 10 or 11-year-old, I suppose I might have helped a little bit, but I don't suppose I helped very much.
Sure. And how do you remember how long after war was declared that sort of the first rumors or first queries about evacuation were brought up, or were you just sort of told that you were going and then you left?
I think I was just told that I was going and then I left.
Yeah, very sudden.
But for a year after war was declared, there was very little activity. The Germans and the British were fighting in France with the French against the Germans, and Britain was very much isolated from the war itself. I mean, things went on more or less as usual.
Yeah.
Except, of course, we had blackouts at night and that sort of thing. And food was rationed and clothing was rationed. But generally, we were removed from the war because until Dunkirk, we didn't really feel that we had our backs to the wall. We felt that we beat the Germans eventually, you know.
Yeah. And you mentioned the blackouts and the rationing. To what extent did that affect you, and sort of your relationships and your schooling and that sort of thing?
Well, it didn't affect schooling so much, the blackout,
Sure.
but obviously it affected our relationships in the evening. We all, air raid warnings were sounded and we all went into the shelter. Well, initially, I think my sister and I slept under the stairs in the house, but it must have affected relationships in the family because there was this threat overhanging everybody, and everyone was sort of slightly scared all the time, you know.
Yeah. Excuse me. So do you remember when evacuation was first, when you were sort of told that you were going?
Yeah, there was a sort of, I think there was probably about a year after the war began that I was told I was going off to America because children were being evacuated to America and to Canada at the time. They were being shipped over there. And then a ship was sunk. It was called the Benares, I think, as far as I remember. And a lot of children lost their lives. So immediately the evacuation by ship was to Canada and America was stopped. And I was on the verge of going off to America because my mother had a friend in America and they had agreed to take me. So that was stopped. And then instead of going to America, I was sent down to Torquay, Paignton in Devon. I was put on a train with lots of other kids, and we all shunted off down to Devon. I stood on the platform of Paignton Station, and people went up and down and chose the kids they would have, and I was chosen by a chimney sweep. And I stayed with him for, I think, about 3 or 4 months, and then I went across the road to a Mr. Lowe, who was a shunter. He shunted trucks around the marshalling yards at Paignton. That was his job. And I stayed with them for about 6 months. And then I moved there was a boy at school, Donald Burgess, and he said to me, well, if you're not happy with these people, why don't you come and live with me? So he said, I'll ask my mum, and I went to school the next day, and he said, yes, Mum says come. So I went and moved in with him, and I stayed with him for about 18 months, I think. It was great.
So,
about my same age, went to the same school. He too, and he and his mother had been evacuated down from Barking in Essex, and I think his father was something to do with the underground. I'm not sure.
Okay. If we back up a little bit, what did you have with you, sort of during this period? How much were you allowed to take?
As far as I remember, I had a small suitcase, and in it, I suppose, I had a change of clothing. Obviously, we were limited because there were so many children on the train. You know, we carried out gas masks, and we had. I was wearing shorts at the time, so I had short trousers and a change of underpants and all that stuff. And I guess.
And the chimney sweep you stayed with, what was it like staying with him?
What was it like staying with who?
The chimney sweep that you stayed with for 4 months.
Well, he'd already got 3 kids of his own. He was a lovely man, but obviously I was billeted on him because no one else seemed to want me. So I remember going to bed with the kids. There was no electricity, no gas light. The house was lit by oil lamps and candles, and it was freezing cold. No central heating or anything like that. So it was awful. It was winter. It was November, I think, and it was freezing cold.
Gosh. And then why did you move to the guy across the road for you said
Well, I think it was only a temporary measure that I stayed with the chimney sweep. So I went to Mrs. Lowe, who lived just opposite, and stayed there for a while. She was in the process of having a baby, and I seem to remember she got very... she used to cry a lot. She used to cry an awful lot.
So what was the food like that you had?
I seem to remember it was good. It was fairly staple, even though I don't think there was very much meat about at the time. But we never felt very hungry, I don't think. We missed sweets a lot because sweets were rationed. I think you got 2 ounces of sweets a week, which wasn't very much. So I think that was a bit of a bind.
So when you were...
During that time, the raid on Exeter, which is not far from Paynton in Devon, and Mr. Lowe's sister was killed, and so there was a general depression in the house,
Yeah. When you were evacuated, did the rationing still apply?
Yes.
In Devon,
yes,
was there still...
It applied until I think it was 1948 that the rationing ended.
Wow, yeah.
Yes, it went on for a long time. In fact, in 1954, I think, some things were still rationed.
Wow.
Because the war really affected Britain very badly.
Yeah, sure. Okay, what would you say, I know it's a difficult question for you, but what would you say was the biggest difference between where you had lived, sort of your home, to where you were evacuated to?
Well, the biggest difference, I suppose, was living with strangers. And one had to make all sorts of adjustments. Things that were the norm in one's own house were not the norm in the house one found oneself in. So one had to adjust to that. And as a 10, 11, 12-year-old, it's not easy, really.
No, definitely.
Because you're used to having your own bedroom, you're used to having your own privacy and playing with your own toys and all the rest of it. And all of a sudden everything is up in the air,
Yeah.
It's a strange situation, really.